Hello, and welcome to our second lecture on Slaughterhouse 5. Now, in our last lecture, we began to discuss ideas of postmodernism and trauma, as well as the metatextual narrative frame of the novel. I'm talking about the book's introduction. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to extend these thoughts a little bit and push them into the text itself. Now, I have to say that I struggled with how I might organize this lecture, because how does one coherently talk about a book like Vonnegut's without constantly getting off track or veering into tangents and distractions? This is a book that resists not only linearity of form, but also linearity of thought. And as such, I think we would be hard-pressed to take a linear approach to even talking about the book. In some ways, I think that that's part of the point of the form of the book. We are meant to feel this lurching pull and push of narrative and sensation just as Billy does, and to an extent as Vonnegut does. So with this in mind, we're going to take a different approach to the lecture. Rather than trying to fit everything into one master narrative, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at some individual moments and then attempting to grasp some sort of meaning by the end. Before we get back to this text, I want to mention a couple of things about the background of the book that I hope will illuminate some of the reasons that this particular work made such an impact, and why I think it stands the test of time better than the rest of Vonnegut's work. And I love the rest of Vonnegut's work, but I think this book is it. This is the book that will be remembered. Vonnegut's writing has continually waxed and waned in popularity over the years, both in kind of popular culture and in the academy. But this book, along with his novel about ideas of religion and technology and the atomic bomb, Cat's Cradle, have maintained a fairly consistent profile. But I have to say that Slaughterhouse 5, this book right here, stands up for precisely the reason that it is difficult, for precisely these difficult aspects of the text. Its lack of linearity, its incredible subjectivity, its confusing structures, its dark humor, its effort to understand and fail these terrible ideas of war and death and trauma. This is the reason it's effective. And it's effective because war and death and trauma, as we were reminded in the text, seem to be this ever-present part of our lives. You might as well write an anti-glacier book, Vonnegut is told. When this book was published in 1969, it's not only our writer who has been through extreme trauma. We talked about the destruction of his parents by the Great Depression. He says of that, "I learned a bone-deep sadness from them." And we have the death of his sister and her husband in this kind of terrible coincidence where she dies of cancer and then he dies in a car wreck a few days later. We have Vonnegut's trauma of the war, of Dresden, etc., etc. But it's not only Vonnegut, it's the entire country that is itself in the middle of a period of extreme upheaval and trauma. Just within about a year or so of the publication of this book, we have a series of incredibly difficult moments in the country. We have the death of Martin Luther King, the death of Robert Kennedy. We have the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. The civil rights movement is in full swing, but the opposition to it is also in full swing. This Vietnam War seemed to be plodding along endlessly, continually churning out the bodies of a generation of the nation's youngest people. These are people who were basically babies, as we are told. This is the backdrop to the publishing of this book. It's no wonder that in the introduction, Mary O'Hare is so pissed about the idea of another war book. With this book, Vonnegut became kind of a spokesman for his generation. This book, like Joseph Heller's Catch-22, Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage, immediately encapsulated the anxieties and disenchantment of a period of turmoil in American history. Slaughterhouse 5 captures the absurdity of that moment in time. So much so that this phrase that we hear continuously, "so it goes," a phrase that is in the text always attached to descriptions of death and loss, from the death of an individual to a massacre, right? So it goes, so it goes. To even when a bottle of champagne is opened and it's flat, the sort of death of that, so it goes. To even when he's discussing the depth of a novel, so it goes. This phrase, "so it goes," in this era kind of slipped into the vernacular. So why tell this story? Well, for Vonnegut, it's important to tell this story, not only because he kind of needs to kind of purge this story from himself in whatever way he can, but also there's a danger in forgetting, I think, or in some way being forced to forget, or having a kind of convenient amnesia for this. From the introduction, he says, "I wrote to the Air Force back then." He's talking about when he was first trying to write this book. "I wrote to the Air Force back then, asking for details about the raid on Dresden. Who ordered it? How many planes did it? Why they did it? What desirable results there had been, and so on. And I was answered by a man like myself in public relations. He said that he was sorry, but that the information was still top secret. I read the letter out loud to my wife, and I said, 'My God, a secret, my God, from whom?' So we're afraid that this particular moment is going to get consigned to the kind of back of the warehouse of history. And that all of these moments, not only all of these moments, but all of these people who died, who faced not only the kind of the death in Dresden, but this kind of recurrent trauma, all of that would get minimized. Another reason that we want to tell this story is this tendency to minimize the importance of this. And this, I think, happens for a couple of reasons. One, perhaps it's part of the kind of convenient eliding of things in war. Another reason is that there's so much trauma in the Second World War. And another reason is that it makes us feel more secure in our point of view, that everything that we did was righteous. This moment when Billy Pilgrim is getting moved to Dresden, he's told, "You needn't worry about the bombs, by the way. Dresden is an open city. It is undefended and contains no war industries or troop concentrations of any importance." And yet, well, so it goes. It's important because many people argue that Dresden is one of the worst events, one of the worst battle-related events in during World War II. I'm not factoring the camps in here. But Vonnegut gives us some numbers in the beginning of the book. He says Dresden, where 135,000 people died as a result of an air attack with conventional weapons. On March 9th, 1945, an air attack on Tokyo by American heavy bombers using incendiaries and high explosive bombs caused the deaths of 83,793 people. The atomic bomb on Hiroshima killed 71,379. Now, it's important um, to kind of mention that these numbers have been revised in the 50 or so years since Slaughterhouse 5 came out. And the number of dead in Dresden has been revised, lowering it to somewhere between 25,000 and 50,000 people. Um, but I think to say that oh well, only 25 to 50,000 people died um, is a kind of absurdity of modern war. And it's striking nonetheless because of the fact that for many years, and even really to this day, people simply didn't talk about Dresden. They didn't know about it. Toward the end of the book, Billy Pilgrim is in the hospital alongside an old war historian who is convinced that nothing really important happened at Dresden, or if it did, everything was justifiable. This old professor, Rumford. Rumford talked to Lily about the bombing one time, and Billy heard it all. Rumford had a serious. Toward the end of the book, Billy Pilgrim is in a hospital alongside an old war historian who is convinced that nothing really important happened at Dresden, or if it did, that everything was justifiable. This old historian, Rumford. Rumford talked to Lily about the bombing of Dresden one time, and Billy heard it all. Rumford had a problem about Dresden. His one-volume history of the Army Air Force in the Second World War was supposed to be a readable condensation of the 27-volume official history of the Army of World War II. The thing was, though, there was almost nothing in the 27 volumes about the Dresden raid, even though it had been such a howling success. The success had been kept a secret for many years after the war, a secret from the American people. It was no secret from the Germans, of course, or from the Russians who occupied Dresden after the war, who are in Dresden still. Americans have finally heard about Dresden, said Rumford. 23 years after the raid. A lot of them now know how much worse it was than Hiroshima, so I've got to put something in my new book about it. From the official Air Force standpoint, of course. It'll be all new. Why would they keep it a secret so long? Said Lily. For fear that a lot of bleeding hearts, said Rumford, might not think it was such a wonderful idea. And then Billy pipes in. So we have Rumford here, who really only wants to kind of toe the company line, right? Now that the secret's out, he's only going to toe the company line about it being such a howling success, minimizing the trauma, damage, and death that the bombing of Dresden created. But Billy comes and pops in here. He says, I was there. It was difficult for Rumford to take Billy seriously since Rumford had so long considered Billy a repulsive non-person who would be much better off dead. Now, with Billy speaking clearly and to the point, Rumford's ears wanted to treat the words as a foreign language that was not worth listening. What did he say? Said Rumford. Lily had to serve as interpreter. He said he was there. He was where? I don't know, said Lily. Where were you? She asked Billy. Dresden, said Billy. Dresden, Lily told Rumford. Oh, he's simply echoing the things we say, said Rumford. Oh, said Lily. He's got echolalia now. Oh. echolalia is a mental condition which makes people immediately repeat things um, that people say around them. But Billy didn't really have it. Rumford simply insisted for his own comfort that Billy had it. Rumford was thinking in a military manner that an inconvenient person, one whose death he wished for very much for practical reasons, was suffering from a repulsive disease. Rumford went on insisting for hours that Billy had echolalia, told the nurses that Billy had echolalia now. Some experiments were performed on Billy. Doctors and nurses tried to get Billy to echo something, but Billy wouldn't make a sound for them. So what we see here is that this old professor is seemingly resorting to anything except except to get this first person perspective of what actually happened. Right? It's easier to toe the company line. It's easier to tell this from the Air Force's perspective because then you don't have any subjectivity. You don't have any emotion. You don't have any dog in the fight. So it's important for us to know that someone, anyone, was there to mark this moment in history. But we also need a kind of marking of what it was before that moment. So where is there? It's Dresden, right? And we get this image of the city before it's bombed, and it's the description of it is almost magical and beautiful. This is from this is the book when the prisoners first arrive in Dresden. This is obviously before it's bombed. The Americans arrived in Dresden at 5 in the afternoon. The boxcars were opened, and the doorways framed the loveliest city that most of the Americans had ever seen. The skyline was intricate and voluptuous and enchanted and absurd. This is a nice kind of run of adjectives that have both a kind of bewildering mental image, right? This enchanted and absurd, but also intricate and voluptuous. This kind of somatic imagery here. Of something that we would desire. It looked like a Sunday school picture of heaven to Billy Pilgrim. Billy Pilgrim, obviously, this kind of symbol of kind of naivety, or maybe kind of simplicity. Somebody behind him in the boxcar said, "Oz." That was I. That was me. This is Vonnegut talking. This is one of the moments he shows up. That was I. That was me. The only other city I'd ever seen was Indianapolis, Indiana. Every other big city in Germany had been bombed and burned ferociously. Dresden had not suffered so much as a cracked window pane. Sirens went off every day, screamed like hell, and people went down into the cellars and listened to radios there. But the planes were always bound for someplace else. Leipzig, Jimenez, Plowns, places like that. So it goes. So we have this kind of image of kind of an unworldly image, something that represents a kind of abstraction of wonder or peace, something that kind of exists outside of the realm of this war somehow. And they are still kind of subjected to it. But everything kind of miraculously passes them by, as if the city itself is under some sort of protection. Of course, what we'll see is this is completely and utterly destroyed. But for Vonnegut, it's important, these moments of entrance into the story. We're going to come back to this later, but these moments of kind of metatextual entrance into the story are important. Because this is in some ways him laying claim to pieces of this story. There's these the kind of fictive narrative. But there's moments in here that Vonnegut wants to lay claim to. And for Vonnegut, um, as we learned in the beginning of this book, this is a story that he doesn't know how to tell. Um, where he's trying to figure out how or if this story can ever be articulated in a way that would be kind of commensurate with the experience itself. How can you say this? How can you find the right language? Part of the plan for Vonnegut then is that he enters and exits at certain points, right? He can only lay claim to certain moments. He can't lay claim to the entire thing. I mentioned before that one of the reasons that I think this book was so effective when it came out, and indeed so effective now, is the way in which the kind of central theme and ideas of this kind of are not only confined to World War II, but they spill out into the kind of the contemporary moment. And in doing so, Vonnegut addresses a lot of events and a lot of trauma that are ongoing. And I think that this is another reason why the language just isn't there. The trauma defies language because we are in some ways still going through it, and certainly still going through it at the time when Vonnegut's writing this. For instance, we see Dresden kind of bleeding into other moments in history. For instance, Billy Pilgrim is at one point driving around his hometown when, and this is from the book, he was stopped by a signal in the middle of Ilium's black ghetto. The people who lived there hated it so much they had burned down a lot of it the month before. It was all they had, and they'd wrecked it. The neighborhood reminded Billy of some of the towns he'd seen in the war. The curbs and sidewalks were crushed in many places, showing where the National Guard tanks and half-tracks had been. "Blood Brother," said a message written in pink paint on the side of a shattered grocery store. There was a tap on Billy's window. A black man was out there. He wanted to talk to Billy about something, but the light had changed. Billy did the simplest thing. He drove on and drove through the scene of even greater desolation. It looked like Dresden after it was firebombed, like the surface of the moon. The house where Billy had grown up used to be somewhere in this, and what was so empty now. In this moment, we see this the past kind of coming into the contemporary moment. We note too that there's this kind of perhaps double commentary here. That it says the people who had lived here had destroyed this, but the kind of evidence that they see is not from the people necessarily who live in the neighborhood destroying it, but these the National Guard tanks and half-tracks, right? These instruments of war being used on a nation's own people. And he sees this. He goes and he sees this as a sort of Dresden, right? And yet he himself at this moment cannot fully articulate this trauma, and so he just has to drive through it. We see this kind of pervasiveness of war and destruction, not only in other wars, but also in these major kind of domestic conflicts. We see there's another moment. Billy is at the Lions Club where he used to be the president. This is again after the war. The speaker at the Lions Club meeting was a major in the Marines. He said that Americans had no choice but to keep fighting in Vietnam until they achieved victory, or until the communists realized that they could not force their way of life on weak countries. The major had been there on 2 separate tours of duty. He told many terrible and wonderful things that he had seen. He was in favor of increased bombings of the North Vietnamese, bombing them back to the Stone Age if it refused to see reason. Billy was not moved to protest the bombing of North Vietnam, and he did not shudder about the hideous things he himself had seen bombing do. He was simply having lunch with the Lions Club, of which he was the past president now. Billy had a framed prayer on his office wall, which expressed his method of keeping going. Even though he was unenthusiastic about living, a lot of patients who saw the prayer on Billy's wall told him that it helped them to keep going, and went like this: God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, and the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Among the things Billy could not change were the past, the present, and the future. Again, there's this kind of bleeding into this kind of bombing of Dresden, bombing in North Vietnam, these kind of moments bleeding into each other. And again, I think that what we see is a Billy Pilgrim who is kind of subjected to this trauma, right? He knows what he's seen, and he's aware of it, and yet he is not motivated, not moved to do anything about it. There's a certain passivity to that, and we're gonna. I want us to keep that in mind. This kind of passivity. This kind of settling for among the things that Billy could not change were the past, the present, and the future, because it's going to be one of the perhaps the criticisms of the Tralfamadorians is that while they do kind of offer this kind of perhaps kind of over intellectualized view of time and of history that is in some ways very comforting, particularly when we're dealing with things like trauma, there is this kind of criticism of a sort of passivity to them, right? That this whole kind of so it goes, so it goes, so it goes that Billy Pilgrim learns from them is a sort of mental white flag, kind of mental giving up. This this commentary about the kind of current state of war becomes even more directed, even more pointed. Right? We know that Billy's son, for instance, is becoming a Green Beret, and then we also see that passages from this book that provide a sort of direct commentary, really. There's a section where Billy Pilgrim is thinking about this book by Kilgore Trout. Kilgore Trout, you might remember, is the kind of hack sci-fi writer who kind of floats about for a little bit in this novel. He's a kind of a hack writer. He's kind of a terrible guy. He's also somebody who is in a good number of Vonnegut's novels. He serves as Vonnegut's kind of stand-in a lot of the time. And we kind of get the idea that the stories that Trout writes are so allegorical that they cannot be sustained. So here's a description of one. This is a book called The Gutless Wonder that Kilgore Trout has written. It was about a robot who had bad breath, who became popular after his halitosis was cured. But what made the story remarkable, since it was written in 1932, was that it predicted the widespread use of burning jellied gasoline on human beings. We're thinking about Agent Orange here, right, in Vietnam, or napalm in Vietnam. uh, on on human beings. It was dropped on them from airplanes. Robots did the dropping. They had no conscience and no circuits, which would allow them to imagine what was happening to people on the ground. Trout's leading robot looked more like a human being and could talk and dance and so on and go out with girls, and nobody held it against him that he dropped jellied gasoline on people. But they found his halitosis unforgivable, halitosis being bad breath. But then he cleared that up, and he was welcome to the human race. It's kind of savage uh, um, imagination of what's going on in Vietnam, right? That um, these the soldiers become so detached from it, like a sense of humanity, um, that they're almost like robots here, right? No discernible conscience because they're dropping this napalm on women and children and civilians, um, and that a society actually does not frown on this, right? That having bad breath is a worse sin um, than doing these terrible things. And whether, however you stand on the Vietnam War, um, this is the image that Vonnegut gives us, that through Trout, that Vonnegut gives us, and it's a pretty savage commentary, not necessarily on the soldiers, but on what war does to not only the soldiers, but to everybody involved in it. And just as kind of an aside, right? Um, this kind of um, dalliance in this Kilgore Trout novel becomes, I think, even more relevant today when this seems to literally be what's going on, right? We have drones, and of course, these drones are controlled by people a lot of the time. But the more and more, the kind of more and more our warfare evolves, the more and more it starts to resemble this kind of dystopic vision by Kilgore Trout. So this leads us back to the beginning of the novel, in this frame narrative when Vonnegut says there's nothing intelligent to say about a massacre. As we've said, language fails. But as we've also already talked about here, we have to tell the truth about this. So how do we how do we do both things simultaneously? Well, we go to Dickinson, right? She tells us, tell the truth, tell it slant. And science fiction is the one way of working this out. And I'm not only talking about science fiction in terms of the kind of time traveling and the alien plot, but also science fiction that really bleeds into the regular narrative. When Billy Pilgrim and the soldiers are in the slaughterhouse, this is what they say. There was a firestorm out there. Dresden was one big flame. The one flame ate everything organic, everything that would burn. It wasn't safe to come out of the shelter until noon the next day. This is the kind of summation of what this flame is. It seems to be something that is alive. It is eating. It has a persona. It has an anima. It has a spirit. Goes on to say it wasn't safe to come out of the shelter until noon the next day. When the Americans and their guards did come out, the sky was black with smoke. The sun was an angry little pinhead. Dresden was like the moon. Now, nothing but minerals. The stones were hot. Everybody else in the neighborhood was dead. So it goes. A little bit later on. It was like the moon, said Billy Pilgrim. The guards told the Americans to form in ranks of 4, which they did. Then they had them march back to the hog barn, which had been their home. Its walls still stood, but its windows and roof were gone. There was nothing inside but ashes and dollops of melted glass. It was realized then that there was no food or water, and that the survivors, if they were going to continue to survive, were going to have to climb over curve after curve on the face of the moon, which they did. The curves were smooth only when seen from a distance. The people climbing them learned that they were treacherous, jagged things, hot to the touch, often unstable, eager, should certain important rocks be disturbed, to tumble some more, to form lower and more solid curves. Nobody talked much as the expedition crossed the moon. There was nothing appropriate to say. One thing was clear. Absolutely everyone in the city was supposed to be dead, regardless of what they were, and that anybody that moved in it represented a flaw in the design. There would be no moon men at all. I mean, this is what happens in this story, right? It's not in this first section, right? We see him say that Dresden was like the moon now, nothing but minerals. And in the second section, Billy Pilgrim says it was like the moon. But then as we get into it, it becomes the moon, almost literally. We shift our kind of narrative perspective to make this city, this image of horror. The only way we can contextualize it is in something that is literally not earthly. Literally, that is kind of cannot support life. And they see this as a kind of, we see this as a kind of lunar expedition, right? They're having to crawl over all of these crags and moon rock types things. But what is the hope of it, right? Again, in this section, I have to point out, he says nobody talked much as the expedition crossed the moon. There was nothing appropriate to say. So we see here the interruption of language is already present at the moment right after the destruction. One of the reasons that we have to do things Vonnegut's way here, we have to tell the truth, but tell it slant from this particular perspective, is what we see at the beginning of the book, what Mary O'Hare complains about at the beginning of the book, the tendency to sentimentalize. We remember her hatred of war stories with Frank Sinatra and John Wayne or some of those other glamorous, war-loving, dirty old men. And we remember her feeling that this just sentimentalizes and makes these people heroic and then creates more wars and more babies have to go and die. And we see this again in this, we see this kind of dialectic laid out frankly in the discussion of the Children's Crusades, again in the beginning of the novel. He says, he kind of boils this down to two different points of view, the historic, the kind of unmasked, unsentimental, and then the romantic point of view. The history in her solemn page informs us that the Crusaders were but ignorant and savage men. Their motives were those of bigotry, unmitigated, and their pathway was one of blood and wars. That's what he says about history. Romance, on the other hand, dilates upon their piety and heroism and portrays in her most glowing and impassioned hues their virtue and magnanimity, the imperishable honor they acquired for themselves, and the great services they rendered to Christianity. Now, in this respect, Vonnegut doesn't have much use for sentimentality. And as a matter of fact, he shows us the kinds of things that sentimentality kind of gets us. We remember before the Americans get shipped out to Dresden, they're in this prisoner of war camp, this kind of absurd scene, really, where it's these kind of ragtag, kind of put upon starving Americans, and they're brought in, and there are these Englishmen there, and these are all Englishmen who really kind of embody this kind of elegant, glamorous, Kipling-esque idea of honor in war. This is what it says about them. They were adored by the Germans, who thought they were exactly what Englishmen ought to be. They made war look stylish and reasonable and fun. So the Germans let them have 4 sheds, though one shed would have held them all. And in exchange for coffee or chocolate or tobacco, the Germans gave them paint and lumber and nails and cloth for fixing up things. So on one hand, right, we maybe see this as being strategic on the part of the Englishman, but on the other hand, what we see is a kind of complete detachment from what it is that the war is creating. These Englishmen are kind of living this kind of heroic motif. They say old bean, and they call the Americans Yanks and all of that stuff. But so they're kind of they're almost kind of performing this role, which separates them and isolates them and insulates them from the war. And the Germans, of course, love this because they want the same thing, right? It almost makes the Germans feel like they are in this kind of heroic struggle as well. And so and so reality constantly gets shuffled and pushed to the back. We also get a kind of American view of this honor, in a not so happy of a turn of an image with this old Colonel Wild Bob, and he's on the train and he's coughing. This is before they get to any of these camps. This is what Vonnegut says. The colonel coughed and coughed and coughed, and then he said to Billy, "You one of my boys?" This was the man who had lost an entire regiment, about 4,500 men, a lot of them children, actually. Billy didn't reply. The question made no sense. "What was your outfit?" said the colonel. He coughed and coughed. Every time he inhaled, his lungs rattled like greasy paper bags. Billy couldn't remember what outfit he was from. "You from the 451st? 451st what?" said Billy. There was silence. Infantry regiment," said the colonel at last. "Oh," said Billy. There was another long silence. The colonel dying and dying, drowning where he stood. And then he cried out wetly, "It's me, boys, Wild Bob." This is what he had always wanted his troops to call him, Wild Bob. None of the people who could hear him were actually from his regiment, except for Roland Weary, and Weary wasn't listening. All Weary could think about was his agony of his own feet. But the colonel imagined that he was addressing his beloved troops for the last time, and he told them that they had nothing to be ashamed of, that there were dead Germans all over the battlefield who wished to God that they had never heard of the 451st. He said that after the war, he was going to have a regimental reunion in his hometown, which was Cody, Wyoming, and he was going to barbecue whole steers. He said all this while staring into Billy's eyes. He made the inside of poor Billy's skull echo with balderdash. "God be with you, boys," he said. And that echoed and echoed. And then he said, "If you're ever in Cody, Wyoming, just ask for Wild Bob." I was there. So was my old war buddy, Bernard V. O'Hare. And then, of course, we'll see that Wild Bob, of course, succumbs to his injuries and sickness. And this, in this scene, what we see is a kind of insustainability of sentimentality. It serves to kind of protect us in some ways from the kind of horrors of war, but in the end, it's fleeting. In the end, it will kind of dissipate. And Billy Pilgrim, for this, this doesn't make any sense to him, because he hasn't really bought into this sentimentality. And within the first, couple of paragraphs here, we get the kind of clashing of the historic or the realistic and the sentimental, right? When he says, "You one of my boys," right? We already see him kind of occupying this kind of like movie like role, Sinatra or John Wayne like role as the colonel, and then we get splashed directly into the reality. A man who had lost an entire regiment, about 4,500 men, a lot of them children. And this is the truth that we can't ignore. This is what sentimentality tries to obscure, but in the end does not. And the problem is, if we don't talk about that, the fact that he lost 4,500 people, a lot of them children, then this guy just becomes like a kind of a comical character or a kind of heroic character. And then he is played by John Wayne or Frank Sinatra in the movie. Besides the risk of kind of deluding yourself from reality, and kind of inspiring more kind of patriotic fervor that leads to war, there's also another kind of danger of this sentimentality that that we see, and we see it in this character of Howard W. Campbell Jr. Um, Howard Campbell Jr. Visits the Americans who have been captured, and he himself is an American. Um, he is actually well, I'll read this and then I'll talk about who he kind of actually is in Vonnegut. He was Howard W. Campbell Jr., an American who had become a Nazi. Campbell was the one who had written the monograph about the shabby behavior of American prisoners of war. He wasn't doing more research about prisoners now. He'd come to the slaughterhouse to recruit men for a German military unit called the Free American Corps. Campbell was the inventor and a commander of the unit, which was supposed to fight only on the Russian front. Campbell was an ordinary-looking man, but he was extravagantly costumed in a uniform of his own design. He wore a white 10-gallon hat and black cowboy boots decorated with swastikas and stars. He was sheathed in a blue body stocking, which had yellow stripes running from his armpits to his ankles. His shoulder patch was a silhouette of Abraham Lincoln's profile on a field of pale green. He had a broad armband which was red, with a blue swastika and a circle of white. He was explaining this armband now in the cement block hog barn. Billy Pilgrim had a boiling case of heartburn since he had been spooning malt syrup all day. Long at work, the heartburn brought tears to his eyes, so that his image of Campbell was distorted by the jiggling lenses of salt water. Blue is for the American sky, Campbell was saying. White is for the race that pioneered the continent, drained the swamps and cleared the forests and built the roads and bridges. Red is for the blood of the American patriots, which was shed so gladly in years gone by. So Campbell is here. He's trying to get them to basically betray the country, betray America, and join this kind of de facto Nazi army and fight in Russia, all under the guise of being this free American, right? And we see this almost cartoonish version of America in him, in which we have a kind of complete distortion of these sentimental images of America. And yet he expects this to be convincing, right? And oftentimes what we find is that this is how this kind of propaganda and sentimentality will get used, right? It gets kind of co-opted, weaponized, and used to make people to convince people that there is something patriotic about it, about an act that is inherently unpatriotic, right? Um, And he stands there, and he is not very good at convincing them. Poor old Derby, the teacher, the high school teacher, who is wonderful because every time he's referred to, Vonnegut um, always tags him with a word like the doomed high school teacher. He's the one who gets shot after Dresden for stealing a clock. This kind of pointless last death of the novel. Um, he stands up to Campbell and kind of pushes off this sentimentalized nationalist ideology. Um, and there is an interesting thing about Campbell. I mentioned this, that there was something interesting about him, and that is this: Campbell is actually, if you read other of Vonnegut's books, particularly Mother Night, which is another one of his books, um, Campbell is actually um, not a Nazi. He is not somebody who necessarily betrayed his country. He is a spy for the Americans who pretends to defect to the Nazis and become a propaganda agent. And that's what Mother Night is all about. Him kind of dealing with the fact that this of having to be sort of complicit in this propaganda as he spies, and also the ways in which he starts to have difficulty um, kind of peeling his regular life and his undercover life apart. But that's in another book. One of the reasons Vonnegut is suspicious of the kind of this kind of sentimentalized rhetoric, this kind of pro-war, very romantic, heroic rhetoric, is that it often gets paired up with these scenes of really terrible violence. We think about Roland Weary, this kind of strange, grotesque guy who Billy Pilgrim ends up with after he is initially separated from his unit, is just kind of wandering. He meets this guy Roland Weary who nobody likes. He's But Roland has this kind of romantic but kind of grotesque view of war, and um, they've got these two scouts with them, and he thinks that he and these two scouts are the Three Musketeers. That's what he keeps calling it, the Three Musketeers. And that he has these visions of after the war they'll get together and reminisce about being the Three Musketeers. Of course, not even thinking about Billy. And of course, also these guys hate him and don't care a thing about him. But he's got this kind of romantic view of war. Um, but the other thing that he has this kind of obsession with is just complete and total violence. Really grotesque violence. This is from when they're out wandering together. Weary had told Billy Pilgrim about the Iron Maiden, about the drain at the bottom and what that was for. He had talked to Billy about dum-dums. He had told him about his father's Derringer pistol, which could be carried in a vest pocket, which was yet capable of making a hole in a man which a bull bat could fly through without touching either wing. Weary scornfully bet Billy one time that he didn't even know what a blood gutter was. Billy guessed it was the drain at the bottom of the Iron Maiden, but that was wrong. A blood gutter, Billy learned, was a shallow groove in the side of a blade of a sword or bayonet. Weary told Billy about the neat tortures that he'd read about or seen in movies or heard about on the radio, about tortures he had invented himself. One of the inventions was sticking a dentist drill into a guy's ear. He asked Billy what he thought the worst form of execution was. Billy had no opinion. The correct answer turned out to be this. You stake a guy down on an ant hill in the desert, you see, his face upwards, and you put honey all over his balls and pecker, and you cut off his eyelids so he has to stare at the sun until he dies. So it goes. Now, lying in the ditch with Billy, the scouts, after having been shot at, Weary made Billy take a very close look at his trench knife, This wasn't government issue. It was a present from his father. It had a 10-inch blade with a triangular cross in the cross section. Um, I'm sorry, a 10-inch blade that was triangular in the cross section. Its grip consisted of brass knuckles, with a chain of rings through which Weary slipped his stubby little fingers. The rings weren't simple; they bristled with spikes. Weary laid the spikes along Billy's cheek, and rowled the cheeks with savagely affectionate restraint. How'd you like to be hit with this, hmm? Hmm, he wanted to know. I wouldn't, said Billy. You know why the blade's triangular? No. Makes a wound that won't close up. Oh. Makes a three-sided hole in a guy. You stick an ordinary knife in a guy, makes a slit, right? Slit closes right up, right? Right. Shit. What do you know? What the hell they teach you in college? Do we see this kind of marriage of sentimentality, of the kind of romance with violence? Again, going back to that kind of dialectic of the Crusades, where the kind of sentimentality, the kind of Three Musketeers nature, covers up these impulse towards really terrible violence. This image of this trench knife with this triangular blade that is designed not only to hurt, but to hurt in a way that is so incredibly painful and cannot be recovered from. This is what we get when we fall into only thinking in this kind of tradition of sentimentality and romance. And it's important that we kind of strip away some of this sentimentality, because when we do, we start to have to really deal with a sort of reality of violence. And I think that Vonnegut sees this kind of violence as extending beyond this particular moment of war or this story or Dresden, that violence is embedded in our culture and our history. Um, this is why we have in the beginning someone say you might as well write an anti-glacier book. But this is a sort of violence with no beginning and no ending. And so let's look at this section. It comes right after what we were talking about in the previous slide. This is a kind of continuation of where Weary is talking about this very grotesque trench knife. He says, shit, what do you know? What the hell they teach you in college? I wasn't there very long, said Billy, which was true. He had only 6 months of college, and the college hadn't been a regular college either. It had been a night school of the Ilium School of Optometry. Joe College, said Weary scathingly. Billy shrugged. There's more to life than what you read in those books. You'll find that out, said Weary. Billy made no reply to this either, there in the ditch, since he didn't want the conversation to go on any longer than necessary. He was dimly tempted to say, though, that he knew a thing or two about gore. Billy, after all, had contemplated torture and the hideous wounds at the beginning and end of nearly every day of his childhood. Billy had an extremely gruesome crucifix hanging on the wall of his little bedroom in Ilium. A military surgeon would have admired the clinical fidelity of the artist's rendition of all of Christ's wounds, the spear wound, the thorn wounds, the holes that were made by the iron spikes. Billy's Christ died horribly. He was pitiful. So it goes. And in this moment, I think that we get a sort of idea, an image that is in some ways very foundational to Western civilization and Western culture, and not that everyone is Christian or values this image in the same way. But it is an image that is, I think, foundational to Western civilization is this image of Christ at Golgotha, the Calvary, him on the cross, right? Um, and we start to decode this a little bit, and we see that this is an incredibly violent, gruesome act that that is easy to sentimentalize, um, that is easy to kind of forget the bodily and somatic harm that comes to Christ in this. Um, Often we think about this as kind of we kind of skip over this part of kind of ultimate torture and almost despair from Christ, right? Um, the lines, "Father, why hast thou forsaken me?" I believe are maybe the only lines in the Bible, or the line is actually, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I think that's the only set of lines that appear verbatim in the Bible in more than one book. I believe they're in Matthew, Mark, and Psalms. Um, that there is this moment of kind of abject despair in that, and that we shouldn't forget about that. We do ourselves a kind of disservice to forget about that, because in forgetting about it, in forgetting about the realness of these wounds, the kind of grotesqueness of these wounds, we see only the ends, right? And so the act itself becomes sentimentalized. The violence itself becomes sentimentalized. And so this violence um, becomes the kind of touchstone of our culture. And, Vonnegut's not the only one who writes about this. I'm thinking of in Ulysses and James Joyce, the opening um, the opening line of Ulysses is stately, plump Buck Mulligan came from the stairhead bearing a bowl of lather on which a mirror and a razor lay crossed, making this kind of bizarre image of the crucifix with a mirror and a razor, which in some ways both represents um, uh, um, Stephen Dedalus and Buck Mulligan, but also represent this kind of narcissism and masochism that Joyce sometimes described Christianity as being. Uh, but yeah, so this is a violence that really has no beginning and no ending. So here's a question then. If we're kind of against this kind of sentimentality that sets us apart from the kind of truth of war and violence, how is the kind of movement that we're doing here into science fiction any better? And I think that's a fair question, right? Because in some ways, right, we are still kind of distancing ourselves from these kind of abject horror. I think the difference lies in the intention. In sentimentality, the intention is to soften and to kind of blur over certain aspects. It's more kind of ideologically bent towards perhaps justifying certain actions. In science fiction, we have the ability to um, take an perhaps a more objective view of the situation, um, And we don't lose track of the violence of it. We just kind of shield ourselves from the kind of immense emotional toll of it. And I think that as we kind of move into the science fiction aspects of this, this is exactly what we're going to see. Um, so, after Billy Pilgrim becomes unstuck in time for the first time, and a little while after that, he gets abducted by this flying saucer with these aliens from Tralfamador. Um, the description of this is of them I love. They were 2 feet high and green and shaped like plumbers' friends. Their suction cups were on the ground, and their shafts, which were extremely flexible, usually pointed towards the sky. At the top of each shaft was a little hand with a green eye on its palm. The creatures were friendly, and they could see in 4 dimensions. They pitied Earthlings for being able to see only 3. They had many wonderful things to teach the Earthlings, especially about time. Um, Now, this is the kind of like the point of view that that Billy is going to um, um, at least attempt to gain through his interactions with the Tralfamadorians, is that they provide this kind of anthropological reading of not only the war, but also this entire culture of death and violence. They pity humans for being able to only to see in 2 dimensions when they can see in 4, and presumably this being able to see in 4 dimensions and kind of flatten out time in a way allows them to gain a better perspective, a less emotionally engaged perspective on the action. Again, perhaps this is the kind of metaphor for kind of this way of dealing, this method of processing trauma through this kind of science fiction lens. Um, and they feel bad for people because people are locked into their own mindsets. Um, and these Tralfamadorians know really nothing of death, and they don't really even believe in this idea of death, at least in the way that we regard it. They think that all moments have always existed. We're always already in existence. Um, and it's just a kind of an illusion in what moment flows into another. For them, this death is an illusion. It's a kind of a fiction. This is from the text. The most important thing I learned on Tralfamador, this is Billy talking, was that when a person dies, he only appears to die. He is still very much alive in the past. So it is very silly for people to cry at his funeral. All moments, past, present, future, always have existed, always will exist. The Tralfamadorians can look at all the different moments just the way we can look at a stretch of the Rocky Mountains, for instance. They see how penitent all the moments are, and they can look at any moment that interests them. It is just an illusion that we have here on Earth that one moment follows another, like beads on a string, and that once a moment is gone, it is gone forever. When a Tralfamadorian sees a corpse, all he thinks is that that dead person is in a very bad condition in that particular moment. But that same person is just fine in plenty of other moments. Now, when I hear that somebody is dead, I simply shrug and I say what the Tralfamadorians say about the dead, which is this: so it goes, and so on. Um, in this, perhaps we see a very kind of healthy view of the world, a world in which we don't have to kind of get entangled in the emotional aspects of this. But I don't think that 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 Vonnegut thinks that this is an easy way to approach it, and I don't even think that he necessarily thinks this is the right way to approach it. But this is a way that is so completely different from what we are taught. It fundamentally realigns our thinking about violence and death and loss. So with these Tralfamadorians, there's also some other aspects of them. Um, they have one, they have this kind of holistic vision, right, where they see all time at once. So they have this kind of strange view of humanity as these kind of great millipedes with baby legs on one end and old people's legs on the other. Kind of get the kind of the image of the riddle of the Sphinx there. Um, but they also believe that free will is essentially only a myth that only kind of exists on Earth. So you have this kind of fatalistic view. Um, and then they kind of ignore these awful times because they know that there's really nothing they can do about it. This is from a section where Billy is talking to them. So said Billy, gropingly, I suppose the idea of preventing war on Earth is stupid too. Of course, they said. But you have a very peaceful planet here. Today we do. On other days, we have wars as horrible as any you've seen or read about. There isn't anything we can do about them, so we simply look at them. We ignore them. We spend eternity looking at pleasant moments, like today at the zoo. Isn't this a really nice moment? Yes. That's one thing that Earthlings must learn to do. If they tried hard enough, they could ignore the awful times and concentrate on the good ones. Now, I think it's important to note here, um, because I think that there is a kind of an impulse to kind of lionize the Tralfamadorians um, because of their kind of otherness or their alien nature or the kind of external perspective that they offer on this war. Um, but there's some critics are kind of divided about this, their point of view about the Tralfamadorians and their values. On one hand, on the kind of plus side, right? Um, um, I'm sorry. Let's start with the negative side. On the negative side, this type of vision implies a sort of total moral paralysis and passivity, right? It's the problem with fatalism, is that it gets into this idea of passivity, and so there's no point in fighting, right? There's no point in doing anything, and we only focus on the good times. But I think that Vonnegut, on the plus side of including this kind of point of view, is that Vonnegut, I don't think, wants us to um, totally buy into the Tralfamadorians. I think he wants us to be critical of them. Um, and to understand that this vision essentially doesn't really work because it requires of us this passivity, both kind of physical and moral passivity. And it's great, again, it's kind of a great coping mechanism, and it's a great way to kind of gain a sort of perspective. But if we gain that perspective and do nothing with it, then it's essentially useless. Um, and I think that we're meant to be a little bit ambivalent because of this, because they do nothing with this perspective. Um, so Billy is essentially, he's very happy on Tralfamador. Um, but I think that we can see Tralfamador as not only being this kind of alien planet, but perhaps a kind of fantasy, a retreat from life for Billy, right? And this, I think that these kind of Tralfamadorian values that suggest only focusing on the positive and this kind of moral and physical paralysis kind of underlines that, this kind of retreat into the fantasy. And we see this. There's a lot of moments where we see a sort of parallel between what happens on Tralfamador and what happens to Billy as he's been going through all these prisoner of war camps and into Dresden. So, for instance, when he is first made a prisoner of war, he's made to strip in this kind of humiliating exercise. And the same thing happens on Tralfamador. We have these kind of same routines that exist. And so what we might wonder is, as we're kind of moving into kind of thinking about this idea again of trauma, is that when our stress, our trauma is bad enough, we need an exit. And when things are so horrible, our only choice is to recontextualize them. In that way, we can start to deal with them. We can gain a perspective. And this is, I think this is particularly important here because there is a feeling of trauma that exists not only due to the war, but also due to a kind of feeling of a lack of agency in the book. There's this kind of lurching dislocatedness in this book, being unstuck in time. And I think it's important for us to notice that Billy Pilgrim is not a time traveler per se. He is unstuck in time. He has no control. He has no agency of where he goes next or when he goes next. He just kind of is kind of lumbering through these moments of space and time, which I think were meant to kind of associate with the kind of dazed and traumatized condition of people who are kind of lumbering through these battlefields in war. He goes back and forth through time. He never knows where he's going to end up. For instance, this is one moment. He got out of bed and said, "Excuse me," and went to the darkness of the bathroom to take a leak. He groped for the light and realized he felt the rough wall that he had traveled back to 1944. He's at first on the night of, he's in bed with his wife. The rough wall that he had traveled back to in 1944, the prison hospital again. And then a few lines later, Billy reeled away from this vision of hell. He passed 3 Englishmen who were watching the excrement festival from a distance. They were catatonic with disgust. "Button your pants," said one as Billy went by. So Billy buttoned his pants. He came to the little door of the hospital by accident. He went through the door and found himself honeymooning again, going from the bathroom back to the bed with his bride in Cape Ann. "I missed you," said Valencia, his wife. "I missed you too, said Billy Pilgrim. And this takes on a kind of this moment of I missed you, takes on a whole nother dimension. When it's no longer just this kind of like sentimentalized wedding night thing of, "Oh, Smoochie, you went to the bathroom for 2 seconds, I missed you." The fact that Billy has moved out of the room into his trauma and come back, that makes this "I missed you" makes there, for at least for Billy Pilgrim, this real moment of departure for him. On the subject of this kind of sci-fi motif, I think it helps for us to look back at this guy Kilgore Trout.
who we talked about a little bit before. He's this kind of hack sci-fi writer who Billy Pilgrim likes, and also kind of functions as a kind of surrogate for Vonnegut himself. And Kilgore Trout actually exists in several of Vonnegut's books. Um, but he theorizes in his science, in his writing. He kind of writes about and kind of theorizes about some of the questions that we've been talking about here. This is one example. Um, there's a book that Pilgrim is reading. The book was Maniacs in the Fourth Dimension by Kilgore Trout. It was about people whose mental diseases couldn't be treated because the causes of the diseases were all in the fourth dimension, and three-dimensional earthling doctors couldn't see those causes at all or even imagine them. So that's the book. Um, now, this to me sounds exactly like what trauma is, um, or post-traumatic stress disorder is. Um, this condition that can seem invisible or inexplicable to people who are not going through it, right? Why does this person just randomly start crying at seemingly unpredictable intervals? Or why does this person see something and they start screaming? Um, this Maniacs of the Fourth Dimension, this is all about trauma. And this is all about the kind of trauma that Vonnegut and Billy Pilgrim are dealing with. Um, so in some ways, we have this kind of metatextual moment, this kind of self-conscious awareness of the text itself in regards to the trauma that pushes this book forward. And again, this metatextual commentary on trauma applies not only to Billy, but also to Vonnegut himself. Because of Vonnegut's kind of metatextual presence within the text, within in Dresden and in the story as a whole. We remember in the kind of the frame narrative at the beginning that that Vonnegut would call call his friends from the war late at night after he'd been drinking. And he always describes him as having mustard gas and roses for breath. And then in the middle of the book, right before the moment when Billy Pilgrim becomes unstuck in time, we see this entrance of Vonnegut. And it's something that if you read too fast, you miss it. This is the section. Billy Pilgrim, he went into his daughter's room. The drawers were dumped. Her closet was empty. Heaped in the middle of the room were all the possessions she could not take on a honeymoon. She had a Princess telephone extension, all her own, on a windowsill. Its tiny nightlight stared at Billy. And then it rang. Billy answered. There was a drunk on the other end. Billy could almost smell his breath, mustard gas and roses. It was the wrong number. Billy hung up. This is a kind of entrance of Vonnegut into the novel. And that he's entering before this incredibly significant point. Before the point before the point where Billy Pilgrim is abducted, right? I think we see this kind of strong connection between Vonnegut and Billy, and that they're both kind of working through the same issues. We see him at several other points too. He's often standing behind Billy, kind of commenting. That's another point. Billy looked inside the latrine. The wailing was coming from in there. The place was crammed with Americans who had taken their pants down. The welcome feast had made them as sick as volcanoes. The buckets were full, or had been kicked over. An American near Billy wailed that he had excreted everything but his brains. Moments later, he said, "There they go. There they go." He meant his brains. That was I. That was me. That was the author of this book. And we see Vonnegut as kind of a presence here that lends a kind of a sense of um, empathy and humanity to the text. When he's talking about the writing of the book, again in the beginning, he says, "But not many words about Dresden came from my mind then. Not enough of them to make a book anyway. Not many words come now either. When I've become an old fart with his memories and his Pall Malls and his sons all fully grown." And we see this, we can kind of think about this in relation to um, the ways, the Tralfamadorians' ways of viewing the world. That really there are no words. There's no point in kind of um, in trying to kind of communicate this. We're just on a kind of progression. So I think what we're moving to as we kind of come to the conclusion of this lecture is that ideally we would gain a sense of serenity um, through perhaps this Tralfamadorian philosophy and lifestyle. Um, because in some ways, it allows us to separate ourselves, to kind of offer commentary on trauma and fear, and not see it as being the kind of beginning and end of our lives. It's just another piece of it. Um, but it never quite works here. Because what we see in Billy Pilgrim is that, to back up for a second, for Vonnegut, science fiction perhaps exists as a kind of escape, right? We mentioned that before about the kind of parallels between when Billy Pilgrim goes on the Tralfamadorian ship and when he is taken prisoner by the Germans. That there's this kind of chance for escape of trauma. But I don't think that we ever quite work out. We don't ever quite work it out in real life here. Billy Pilgrim is somebody who is falling apart. He is not, I mean, physically he is, we kind of get these descriptions of his rough conditions. And he's not just unstuck in time, but he's emotionally coming undone. In the train car, there's a scene in the train car when he is so exhausted, but he's still moving around in his sleep. In his sleep, he cries and he yells and he kicks. This is the section from there. So Billy stood up again, clung to the cross brace. "Where can I sleep?" he asked quietly. "Not with me." "Not with me, you son of a bitch," someone else said. "You yell, you kick." "I do." "You're goddamn right you do, and whimper." "I do." "Keep the hell away from here, Pilgrim." And now there was an acrimonious madrigal, with parts sung in all quarters of the car. Nearly everybody seemingly had an atrocity story of something Billy Pilgrim had done to him in his sleep. Everyone told Billy Pilgrim to keep the hell away. So Billy Pilgrim had to sleep standing up or not sleep at all, and the food had stopped coming. in through the ventilators, and the days and nights were all colder than the same. Later on, when he is um, when Billy is at this camp with these very jocular, Kipling-esque British soldiers. They're putting on a play, and there's a there's some rhymes in it, and there's a couplet. This is the description of Billy Pilgrim's reaction to that. Billy found one of the couplets so comical that he not only laughed, he shrieked, and he went on shrieking until he was carried out of the shed into another, where the hospital was. It was a 6-bed hospital. There weren't any other patients in there. Billy was put to bed and tied down and given a shot of morphine. So we see Billy Pilgrim weeping and moaning and kicking and shrieking, whether he is asleep or whether he is awake. And at some point, there is a kind of a moment where, in the mental hospital after the war, staff, the people who work there are trying to unpack this, and they think that Billy's trauma comes from childhood events rather than from the war. This is a section. Night came to the Garden of Giraffes, and Billy Pilgrim slept without dreaming for a while, and then he traveled in time. He woke up with his head under a blanket in a ward for nonviolent mental patients in the Veterans Hospital near Lake Placid, New York. It was springtime in 1948, 3 years after the end of the war. They didn't think it had anything to do with war. They were sure Billy was going to pieces because his father had thrown him in the deep end of the YMCA swimming pool when he was a little boy, and had then taken him to the rim of the Grand Canyon. There's this attempt here to pin trauma on anything but the war for the people who are supporting this war, right? Again, we have this kind of fight we need to get into against sentimentality. This couldn't be the war. The war was too heroic for this to happen. This must have been something in childhood. And in a way, perhaps they're right. Again, we think about this idea of trauma with no beginning and no ending. Remember our discussion about Roland Weary's knife and this image of the crucifixion. And yet, to completely elide the war in this seems kind of pornographic in a way. And yet, these people, they never quite get it, right? Because he has no real physiological, no somatic signs of pain or trauma, right? But it still hurts. It still is. He still has this kind of unimaginable pain in some way. Again, we think about this Kilgore Trout book, For Maniacs, where regular doctors, earthling doctors, cannot understand what's going on with these people who are sick because all of the things happen in the fourth dimension. Again, this kind of perfect image of trauma that's tucked right in the middle of this book. But there's a scene in particular where we get this kind of masterful representation of trauma. This is when he's at this party, this anniversary party, for he and his wife. Now an optometrist called for attention. He proposed a toast to Billy and Valencia, whose anniversary it was. According to the plan, the barbershop quartet of optometrists, the Febs, sang while people drank, and Billy and Valencia put their arms around each other, just glowed. Everybody's eyes were shining. The song was That Old Gang of Mine. Gee, the song went. But I'd give the world to see that old gang of mine, and so on. A little later it said, so long forever, old fellows and gals, so long forever, old sweethearts and pals, God bless 'em, and so on. And here's this kind of moment of trauma, and we think of trauma here in this moment as this trauma as a moment of memory and recall. Unexpectedly, Billy Pilgrim found himself upset by the song and the occasion. He had never had an old gang, an old sweetheart, and pals, but he missed one anyway. As the quartet made slow, agonized experiments with chords intentionally sour, sourer still, unbearably sour, and then a chord that was suffocatingly sweet, and then the sour ones again. Billy had this powerful psychosomatic responses up to the changing of chords. His mouth filled with the taste of lemonade. His face became grotesque, as though he were really being stretched on the torture engine called the rack. Again, we have this callback to his conversations with Weary. He looked so peculiar that several people commented on it solicitously when the song was done. They thought he might have been having a heart attack, and Billy seemed to confirm this by going to a chair and sitting down haggardly. There was silence. Oh my God, said Valencia, leaning over him. Billy, are you all right? Yes. You look so awful. Really, I'm okay. And he was, too, except for that he could find no explanation for why the song had affected him so grotesquely. He had supposed for years that he had no secrets from himself. Here was proof that he had a great big secret somewhere inside. He could not imagine what it was. And here we have kind of perhaps the real heart of trauma. These things that never get worked into our psyche, right? That's what Freud talked about. This is what people in trauma theory talk about. This memory that cannot pass into the psyche because it is too awful. And so we keep recalling it in these awful emotional ways, and it comes out in these bursts of things that we can't even explain. And this is exactly what's happening to Billy. And this is exactly, I think that it is telling that it happens in this kind of very sentimental moment, right? This song is very sentimental and kind of romanticizing the kind of the old gang. And Billy has this violent reaction to it. And not only this mental reaction to it, but a somatic, a bodily reaction to it, of kind of where he is feeling it and tasting it, and he ultimately desires to reject it. This is the indication that there is this trauma in him somewhere. A few pages later, we might get a kind of idea what this trauma comes from. We kind of hop back to Dresden. A guard would go to the head of the stairs every so often to see what it was like outside, and then he would come down and whisper to the other guards. There was a firestorm out there. Dresden was one big flame, the flame that ate everything organic, everything that would burn. It wasn't safe to come out of the shelter until noon the next day. When the Americans and their guards did come out, the sky was black with smoke. The sun was an angry little pinhead. Dresden was like the moon. Now nothing but minerals. The stones were hot. Everybody else in the neighborhood was dead. So it goes. And here's the moment of memory. The guards drew together instinctively, rolled their eyes. They experimented with one expression and then another and said nothing, though their mouths were often opened. They looked like a silent film of a barbershop quartet. So long forever, they might have been singing. Old pals. So long forever, old sweethearts and pals. God bless them. Here we see the kind of playing out of this traumatic memory. And we see the way that that the romantic, the sentimental, and the kind of historic or the traumatic memory get intertwined, and eventually the sentimental gets undone. The sentimental cannot hold the center, and it erupts later with Billy. And so I want to come to the kind of the end of this lecture, um, because I want to kind of keep this kind of specifically focused on this idea of trauma in Slaughterhouse Five. There's millions of other things that we could talk about, but I think that this is one of the most striking. Um, I think that one of the major desires of this book, one of the major desires in dealing with trauma, um, is in a way a kind of desire to become unstuck in time, but not necessarily the way that Billy Pilgrim is unstuck in time, getting kind of um, pushed this way and that way, but going back in time so that we can see trauma undone. That's the real desire here. And we see it for just a moment. Um, Again, this right before he's abducted by the Tralfamadorians, when he's hanging out after his daughter's wedding. And I think that this is a kind of a beautiful scene, and this is my favorite passage in all of Vonnegut, and maybe one of my favorite passages in American literature. Billy Pilgrim padded downstairs on his blue and ivory feet. He went into the kitchen, where the moonlight called his attention to a half bottle of champagne on the table, all that was left of the reception in the tent. Somebody had stoppered it again. Drink me, it seemed to say. So Billy uncorked it with his thumbs. It didn't make a pop. The champagne was dead. So it goes. That's I think, my favorite so it goes moment right there. Billy looked at the clock on the gas stove. He had an hour to kill before the saucer came. He went into the living room, swinging the bottle like a dinner bell, turned on the television. He came slightly unstuck in time, and he saw the late movie backwards and then forwards again. It was a movie about American bombers in the Second World War and the gallant men who flew them. Seen backwards by Billy, the story went like this. American planes full of holes and wounded men and corpses took off backwards from an airfield in England. Over France, a few German fighter planes flew at them backwards and sucked bullets and shell fragments from some of the planes and crewmen. They did the same for the wrecked American bombers on the ground, and those planes flew up backwards to join the formation. The formation flew backwards over a German city that was in flames. The bombers opened their bomb bay doors, exerted a miraculous magnetism which shrunk the fires, gathered them into cylindrical steel containers, and lifted the containers into the bellies of the planes. The containers were stored neatly in racks. The Germans below had miraculous devices of their own, which were long steel tubes they used to suck more fragments from crewmen and planes. But there were still a few wounded Americans, though, and some of the bombers were still in bad repair. Over France, though, German fighters came up again, made everything and everybody good as new. When the bombers got back to their base, the steel cylinders were taken from the racks and shipped back to the United States of America, where factories were operating night and day, dismantling cylinders, separating the dangerous contents into minerals. Touchingly, it was mainly women who did this work. The minerals were then shipped to specialists in remote areas. It was their business to put them in the ground, to hide them cleverly so they would never hurt anybody ever again. The American Flyers turned in their uniforms, became high school kids, and Hitler turned into a baby, Billy Pilgrim supposed. That wasn't in the movie. Billy was extrapolating. Everybody turned into a baby. All humanity, without exception, conspired biologically to produce two perfect people named Adam and Eve, he supposed. Now, this is, I think, the ideal right here. This is the ideal function of time travel. A desire to undo trauma and return to a pre-fallen state. In this little section, we move from this kind of the grotesque ghastliness of war really to this pre-lapsarian, pre-fallen state of Adam and Eve, two perfect people. A place, the only place that exists before trauma. And that's the desire here. But, of course, this kind of innocence can only be returned to through art. When Vonnegut actually does attempt to go back, like in the war movie, instead of finding some sort of return to innocence, he ends up back at the scene of this great horror of Dresden. As he goes back in time and visits it again, he says there were hundreds of corpse mines operating by and by. They didn't smell bad at first, were wax museums, but then the bodies rotted and liquefied and stank. It was like roses and mustard gas. That's such a nice, I mean, it's a terrible image, but this moment of what it really feels like to go back to get to the scene of the crime, right? We don't get to erase trauma like this. If we were to become unstuck in time and go back, we would see the results, right? And it's when Vonnegut writes here, but then the bodies rotted and liquefied, and the stink was like roses and mustard gas. Again, it's almost as if Vonnegut himself is breathing on this scene. This is exactly the same description that Vonnegut gives of his own breath while he is attempting to kind of mentally go back in time to this as he's calling his old friends from the war. The stink like roses and mustard gas. So this is what happens when you actually go back. The wound doesn't close. And so there's not necessarily a happy ending here. I mean, we do have a piece where Billy gets assassinated. But there's not a happy ending here. There's not even really so much a climax to this novel. And that's because I think the entire organizing structure is broken down. We're not expected to be able to put a linearity on this trauma. We're not expected to be able to put boundaries around it. We're not expected to be able to get past this. But what we do have to do is to talk about it, to try and communicate it, even though our language is failing and futile in this postmodern way. We have to talk about it, because we have to remember the traumas that we have been through and the traumas that we have caused, because these have real-world implications. And even though our language fails us, we have to find a way to communicate it. And that's what this book is. This pain, this trauma, is transformed to this kind of black humor and science fiction. And in doing so, we make it a little bit more bearable. But we don't make it bearable just so that we can keep going on living, though that is something necessarily that we need to do. But so that we can take the measure of how horrible it was from a safe distance. So that's it. This is the end of our lecture on Slaughterhouse 5. And I think it's a difficult book because it does, even though in some cases the language is very simple, I think that it challenges us in ways that perhaps we don't necessarily think about on our first read-through of it. It's an incredibly dense book in terms of imagery and in terms of character, and we didn't actually even really get into that much of that. But I think it's important that we stop and we take a view of this book and attempt to try to find some sort of meaning, even though the meaning may end up slipping through our fingers, right? Even though we may be, in the end, incapable of fully actualizing this meaning from this text. I think what Vonnegut wants us to do is to try and find ways to talk about it, and try and find ways that we can tell the truth, as Dickinson said, even if we have to tell it slant. So if you have any questions, please email me. Thank you.